Hello, it's Drisk here and welcome to another fantastic video on my series for the best games of a letter, Arcade Edition. And this is for the letter P. This is where I imagine I can only choose 5 games per letter per system and have to discard all else. What would I choose? So this means I'm not coming at it from the point of view of what games are most revered or important to video gaming history, but instead that simple question, what games do I personally enjoy to play most of all? Now this series is all a bit of fun really, and it's just here to highlight some great arcade games and maybe rekindle some nostalgic memories or introduce you to some titles that perhaps are new to you and encourage you to give them a go. As I mentioned, this video is my favourite arcade games for the letter P. So without further ado, let us begin. Right, okay, for my 5th choice, I've gone for the fantastic update to Pac-Man by Namco called Pac-Mania. Released in 1987, and this was the 8th in the Pac-Man series, including the spin-offs. And it has a hapless hero set on an isometric viewpoint this time, with the maze, and during this 3-year gap since his last outing on Pac-Land, our yellow pill muncher hasn't been idle, no siree, and he's now learned to jump, or that belly bounce, over the ghosts this time. Now the ghosts meanwhile have 2 additional friends from the normal Pac-Man lineup. There's Sue from Miss Pac-Man and Pac-Land fame, and joining her this time is a ghost called Funky, who's exclusive to this game and is annoyingly a ghost that can jump as well, which is really annoying because you can't use the jump trick on him without dying. Now I have such fantastic memories of this game, and that's partly because of the great home ports and the Amigas and the consoles, which meant that whilst growing up, although the actual arcade version itself passed me by, with me never seeing this in the actual arcades back in the day, I nevertheless became hopelessly in love with this game because of the great home ports, and I'd played it to death. So naturally, as soon as MAME became a thing, this was one of the games that I immediately turned to. And you know, looking at it, it's easy to understand why I had such an affinity with this game, and still to this day, because it's so much fun. From the catchy adrenaline pumping music to different mazes set across 4 worlds of a varying difficulty. There's Block Town, the easiest, Pac-Man Park, or Sandbox Land, and if you beat all of those you get to see a final 4th world called the Jungly Steps, which is the hardest. So there's loads of variety here to keep you interested. There's also nice touches added to the game as well. There's additional power-ups to the standard power pill. This time there's green pills that sometimes appear that moves our Pac-Man faster, and a red pill to give him temporary double points, which is great if you're doing the score hunting. Yes, all in all, this game is a sheer delight, and it's one that is particularly wonderful to finally see in its original arcade cabinet glory, because the cabinet design itself is simply stunningly beautiful. Now to play this game today, well, it's appeared on numerous compilations over the years, with Pac-Man Museum on the 360, PS3 and Windows being the most recent. But if I'm honest, the MAME emulation does a far better representation than the official Pac, because Pac-Man Museum really does have poor emulation and it's poorly done overall. But thankfully, this is another machine that can be found in Arcade Club in Bury, and you can play this gorgeous game as it was meant to be played and seen, and it's a real pleasure to behold. Okay, let's go on to my 4th choice, and I've gone for the lesser known 3D Capcom fighter called Project Justice, or Rival Schools 2, and released on the Naomi board in the year 2000. Like the first game, this has a range of school stereotypes, from science jocks to school nerds, all inexplicably smashing each other over the head for some reason. Well, in fairness, the game does try to explain this in the story mode, but you know me, I just click through all the dialogue just to get to all that fun, smashy goodness of the game itself, rather than understand what's going on. Yes, for those who know their Capcom 3D fighters, then you'll know pretty much how this works. It does share a lot of the mechanics. But the thing that sets it apart for me is the team up special. This allows you to temporarily bring in another team member, sort of tagging them into the action. And they all have varying set pieces depending on the character you tag in. Now this can be something as simple as increase the health through pep talk to your current fighter, or a wonderful attack on the enemy. This in turn can be stopped by your opponent either way by doing a counter attack and defeating the special move. And these special modes are great, with them being really imaginative and unique to each fighter. My favourite has to be Ran Hibiki, who is the girl with the camera. Watching her swoop in and all the other fighters temporarily pose with cheesy grins for a picture before being pummeled is a real joy. And the first time I saw this game and saw that special move, I knew I was in love with this and had to play it more and more. And that's it really. I just love everything about this game. It's got cool school settings, amazing music, a great list of characters to fight with, a wonderful array of moves, and all the goodness that Capcom brings to the fighting genre. And if I'm honest, with the team up mode as well, this actually makes it my favourite 3D fighter to play. It's just one that I keep coming back to. I just adore this game. Now the game was released on the Dreamcast outside of the arcade, unfortunately nowhere else, but thankfully the Dreamcast version is really solid because it's of course essentially the same as the arcade board hardware wise. But sadly actually it goes for an incredible amount of money, particularly the PAL version, often selling more than the arcade original PC board itself, as crazy as that sounds. So thankfully these days through emulation, the Dreamcast or the Naomi board can be done by emulators such as Redream, which does an amazing job on the PC. And so there's wonderful ways to play this game again and find the same love hopefully that I have towards it. So I urge you to give this game a go. It is a title that's sadly missing in Arcade Club at the moment, and that's a real shame. It's well worth giving this a go if you can. Right, okay, let's go on to my number 3 choice, and for this I've gone for Sega's Yu Suzuki Classic Racer Power Drift, released in 1988 and involving a buggy racing over madcap roller coaster like tracks. This game was really quite revolutionary, with it being the first game I can think of that had the distinctive characters you could choose to race against and actually see them as distinctive within the game itself. And remember, this was years before Mario got his go-karting license. Now the game has 5 cups, or confusingly courses here, and it's A through to E, each with their round 5 tracks and a hidden track contained on each, offering the player a huge amount of choice as you play through the game. Each course also has its own dedicated music track done by the legend Hiroshi Miyauchi. Yes, he of Outrun and Afterburner music fame, to name but a few. And again, he doesn't disappoint here, with a great set of toe-tapping music tracks to race along to. And that's it with the game, really. It's fun, it's fast, with only the crazy, twisty roller coaster tracks sometimes causing confusion for the player. And I know that this puts some gamers off the game, but for me, stick with it. There's loads to love here, and it becomes very rewarding when you master all the tracks. Now, incidentally, if you're skilled enough to come first on all these tracks in a course, and I'm certainly not one of them yet, then you're treated to an extra hidden track. On each of these courses, A, C and E, your buggy turns into the Afterburner plane on the final special track to race the other buggies against. You can do the same on courses B and D and you get the hang-on bike. These are cool extras, and it's something it's wonderful to work towards. I've just shown you here today using the cheat function on main, because unfortunately this is a bit out of my skill range on this title to achieve first on every single track. It's very difficult to do. Now playing this today, well, there's thankfully a few ways to give this game a go. The best way for me personally is the 3DS with the Sega 3D Classic Collection, which was a physical release that had a number of remastered Sega games, Power Drift being one of them. It did get a Western release as well. They were all fantastic ports by M2, and it really improves on the arcade original with smooth frame rates that don't drop, and it allows you to race in visual 3D. You can put the 3D function and see it in all its true 3D glory. Also, very recently, Arcade 1UP, those companies that make mini consoles, have released in America only a sit-down version arcade cabinet that includes Outrun, Turbo Outrun, Outrunners and Power Drift, all on a beautiful sit-down cabinet. Now, outside of that, really the only place to play it is on the Japanese-only Sega Saturn release, which is a great version. It's one that I have a lot of time for. And also the hugely expensive Yu Suzuki Collected Works Volume 1 on the Dreamcast, which costs an arm and a leg to pick that up. Now, they are the only official ways to play the arcade original, but it did have some pretty good home ports as well. There's the TurboGrafx, I think, is probably the best version, but I've got a soft spot on the home versions. I loved the Spectrum version, and I thought the Amiga version was pretty solid as well, considering. So there's plenty of ways to rekindle the memories of all this. Now, emulation wise on MAME it does work as well, but I've never been able to get the controls quite right like it is in the arcade, and so normally I personally stick to the 3DS and Sega Saturn versions. Beyond that, I understand that in Arcade Club in Leeds it apparently has a Power Drift sit-down deluxe cabinet in all its moving cabinet glory. Now, of course, I remember this back in the day, but I also remember very recently it being shown in some of the retro meetups where they had this. It's wonderful playing the deluxe version. That's the cabinet, sit-down cabinet that moves. It really makes a huge difference to the game, and it's definitely the way to play it today. Yes, overall, this is another Sega Yu Suzuki classic and well worthy of your time. It maybe doesn't get the same level of love as games like Outrun, and you could argue rightly so, but this is still a great arcade racing classic. Right, okay, now we come to my number 2 choice, and for this it had to be Pac-Land, released way back in 1984 by Namco. This was the 7th title in the Pac-Man series and was a real departure from the other games, with it being a scrolling platformer and based on the Hanna-Barbera cartoons of the time of Pac-Man. Now, the idea of this game is to take Pac-Man to help a lost fairy back to Fairyland and then return home back with your loving family. It's more difficult than it sounds, as along the way you have to go through a ghost city, a forest which is filled with ghosts, and they're all looking to stop you and kill you. Thankfully, when you make it to Fairyland, the Fairy Queen will give you some magic flying boots and will help you jump really high and keep in the air, making a return journey that little bit quicker. Also, thankfully, power pills are helpfully strewn around this game as well, which of course allows, like in the original game, for Pac to be able to do some serious ghost chomping for a brief amount of time and be invincible. The game has ultimately 8 round trips in the game, which is an awful lot, and they all have increasing difficulty and a vast array of things and challenges set against you as you take the fairies back home. Now, the game, I think, deserves a lot more focus and the importance it had in video game history. Yes, there was Jump Bug in 1981, and yes, technically that was the first scrolling platformer, but it really was this game and not that which would inspire games like Super Mario Bros. And Wonder Boy, and therefore all platform games since. It was also the first game to have parallax scrolling in it. Now, this game was wonderful because it was filled with secrets, such as on level 1, the hidden hard hat power-up that protects your noggin from falling ghosts by just pushing a fire hydrant out the way to pick it up before the first power pellet. Or it had neat little touches, such as at the end of every level, score jumping being changed by how you jumped at the end of the stage. Be as close to the ground but not actually on it, and you'll gain extra points. Now, both of these elements of hidden secrets and even the jump mechanic at the end of each level were aped by Super Mario Bros. That following year, so it's well worthy to note that, because Super Mario Bros. Clearly was inspired by it. I do love the fact that this game is chock full of secrets throughout, with pretty much every stage having something hidden, or some hidden item or trick to it, which makes replayability of this game simply endless. I can't express the level of joy when you first discover one of these secrets, and that's why I'm not going to spoil them all here, apart from the first one, to give you a clue of the kind of things and how it works. But it's not just how important the game is, of course, to video gaming history. It's all about how much fun, and I've had so much fun with this game over the years. I mean, originally the cabinet only had buttons and no joysticks, so you would have 3 buttons, one for left, one for right and one for jump, and you would frantically bash the left and right buttons to run faster, and then do the 3rd button for jumping. Now, later variants of the arcade, they'd installed the joystick, which was becoming far more the norm, and a single jump button instead. Yes, overall I adore this game. Having played many of the home ports on the Spectrum and the Amiga, and I know they get derided on the Spectrum in particular, and the Amiga really, but I certainly had a grand old time with them, and I loved playing through with it back in the day. Now these days the best way to play it legitimately is the Pac-Man Museum on the 360, PS3 and PC, although again I stress this is really poor emulation and it's rather shameful. Much better in fact actually is the Namco Museum Volume 4, which was on the original PlayStation. It actually does better emulation of this game than that more recent one. There's really good home ports. The TurboGrafx is a really good one. The Sharp X68000 or the Lynx are also probably the best renditions in the home of this game. Now these days, until Namco do a better compilation, the best way to play it is still via emulation, unfortunately. We're using MAME for example, which does give the best version of the game, being absolute arcade perfect. Now thankfully this is another one that is in the arcade in Bury. Yes, I know, but it's worthy of mention. It's a wonderful place. Really my best own personal Disneyland, as it were. I love it and can't wait to go back there. And this does a great job, although it is the joystick version and not the fire button version, which is a shame. I have been lucky enough to play the original version in some of the retro events, and it's just a great way of playing the game. I think it works better with buttons than wiggling the joystick. Okay, so that brings me on to my first choice, and I've gone for the game Pang, released by Mitchell in 1989. Now, it's known in Japan as Pumping World or Buster Brothers in America, and this is a spiritual successor of the little-known title by Hudson Soft in 1983 called Cannonball, which was released on the MSX and the humble Spectrum. But although it's a similar idea of popping bubbles, Pang is really its own game entirely. There is a story of sorts to explain the madcap action. You can play 1 or 2 intrepid bubble hunters who, armed with their trusty harpoons, travel country to country to rid the world of these killer bubbles that are attacking all the famous landmarks set around the world. Now, gameplay wise, it's a bit like Asteroids meets a platformer. You see, each time you pop a bubble, it will split into 2 smaller bubbles which bounce lower and thus must also be destroyed. Pop right down to the smallest bubble and they all disappear. Clear all the bubbles on the screen and you move on to the next level. Each country is set with 3 stages. There's a morning stage, a dusk stage and a night stage, each with a different colour backdrop of the landmark that you're on. Achieve all of these 3 levels and you move on to the next country and repeat through. Now, to aid you in your quest, there's a range of power-ups in the game which give you everything from harpoon shots to a dynamite that immediately turns all the remaining bubbles to their smallest bubble immediately, absolutely swarming you with lots of tiny bubbles, which can be a death trap in most cases. Because you really have to watch out, because if one of these killer bubbles touches you or the other player, then you will lose a life and both of you will need to re-attempt the level. Yes, I simply adore this game, from the famous landscape backdrops to the wonderful lineup of amazing tunes that play perfectly with the game, being the perfect accompaniment to the action. But mostly it is the gameplay that is so compelling with this game, with it being just so much fun and actual genuine strategy of how to tackle each level to progress through. Now, like most people back in the day, I've sadly never actually seen this game in the arcades, with only the fantastic home ports on the C64, Spectrum and Amstrad, and especially the Amiga and Atari ST ports, which incidentally the 16-bit versions are nigh on perfect. Only removing the enemy animals, which quite frankly are quite annoying in the arcade original. I actually prefer them without them. The console versions are also really good for the game. There's the SNES version and also the TurboGrafx CD. Now the TurboGrafx CD has CD music and it's slightly different visuals, which does deviate from the arcade original, which I don't like. Now the happy years I've spent playing solidly the Amiga version with my friends, it still makes this one of my favourite arcade games of all time. It's definitely up there in my top 5 overall. Now thankfully, years later in 1997, well 1998 in the UK, the Buster Brothers collection was released on the original PlayStation. Now this gave faithful renditions of Pang, Super Pang and Pang 3, but with remixed versions of the tunes. Now I still prefer the original chiptunes versions of the songs, but undoubtedly this is still the best way to legitimately play these games. Although unfortunately the Buster Brothers PS1 collection does attach quite a big price to buy it these days, which is a real shame. Now outside of that, MAME is the worthy option for emulation. It does run everything perfectly. Unfortunately, this is one title actually that's missing in Arcade Club. They do have Super Pang and Pang 3 sometimes on display, but they've never shown the original game, and I think that's a real shame because I personally think that this one, the first one, has never been bettered, with the second having unnecessary complications and adding too many gimmicks, and the third, actually I quite like the third, but again the different characters have too many options with how they fire the harpoons. I just like the simplicity of the original really, but that's not to say all the Pang games are absolutely top notch and worthy of your time. Okay, so that was my personal top 5 that I would choose for the letter P. Of course, there's oodles of big hitters and hidden gems that are well deserving of a mention. So let's begin with some of the big hitters. Okay, for the first big hitter, they don't come much bigger than this. It is, of course, Pong, released in 1972, and it's definitely worthy of a mention. Now, it may not have been the first video game as sometimes bizarrely put across in some video history articles at times, but it definitely was the first video game that took video gaming from the geek and hobbyists to truly the mainstream. And it certainly put Nolan Bushnell and Atari as household names. Now, to play the game today, well, the Atari Vault collection on the PC has a wonderful version of Pong included, along with many arcade classics. It's a joy to play, particularly as it actually, unlike the original, it does do single player, so you can enjoy playing this yourself and seeing what all the fuss is about. Then of course another huge hitter is of course Pac-Man, released in 1980 by Namco. This was the first game to have a marketable and recognisable hero, and this again helped progress video games to the masses. Now this game is of course so much fun, and it's very important to video gaming history. All of that's undisputed. But for me, I just couldn't choose it. I get bored with the mazes. I just can't get better at the game, and therefore I couldn't put this in my top 5 list, preferring Pac-Mania sequel. Of course, Pac-Man's success meant there were a string of sequels, all worthy of your time. My favourite probably is Miss Pac-Man of the Maze games, but for the ones beginning with P at least, Pac and Pow, released in 1983, is probably my favourite. This adds another friend called Miru and has lots of neat touches, such as flipping the cards to open gates to get the fruit, and all of this makes it far more than just yet another Pac-Man again being released, with it really standing on its own ideas here. Now another big hitter fondly loved is Atari Paperboy, released in 1985. This was huge back in the day with many kids, myself myself included, because we really related to the game, because we were doing the paperboy job ourselves, and we always dreamed of delivering papers like it was in the American films of the kid hurling the paper onto the front porch. You'd certainly be fired quickly if you did that in England. Instead, we were dealing with letterboxes and snarling dogs on the other side. Now, doing the American style of hurling papers whilst on your bike was genius fun, and it was so great smashing the windows of the non-subscribers and elegantly landing on the doorstep, or even for extra points throwing the paper into the mailbox itself for your subscribers, hopefully keeping them for the next day. It's also full of madcap enemies and characters all trying to block your path on these busy streets as you work your way through. Now, for me, most of my memories of this game isn't from the arcade original. It's actually the brilliant home ports, the Spectrum, the Atari, the Amstrad, the C64, and the Amiga also had fantastic versions of the game. Now, playing the arcade original cabinet itself, I find personally the game has far too sensitive controls, and I've played it recently because yes, this is another one in Arcade Club, and it still is so difficult to play, making for me the home ports of the game far better than the arcade original. Now, if you do want to play legitimately the arcade original games, then I'd suggest Midway Arcade Treasure compilation, which came out on the GameCube, the PS2 and the Xbox era, or MAME emulation are the best, although like the arcade original, I think you'll be quite surprised how loose the controls are and how difficult it is to control the bike. Okay, another game is Parodius Die, released by Konami in 1990, and it's a great game, being the sequel to the 1988 MSX title called Parodius, and it's essentially a parody of the Gradius games. Get the name Parodius, and so it replaces all those boring enemy ships with madcap penguins and pirate kitten ships, all for you to enjoy and attack. Now, I'm not sure what it says about me, this, but I'm kind of indifferent to Gradius, but as soon as you replace those boring ships with crazy penguins and bright colours, I just adore this game in all its madcap glory, and even though I know essentially it is kind of the same game under the hood with all the same mechanics, still it's one that I definitely suggest giving this game a go. Then there's Phoenix, released in 1980, made by Amstar and published by Taito. Now, this is a great shooter and so important to video game history because this is the first multi-screen shooter with different waves and enemies. It also had the first ender level boss in an arcade game, with you taking on a huge mothership for you to destroy. Now, thankfully, the game also appears on the Taito Legends pack, so there is a way to legitimately play this classic. It's certainly one of the favourites of my wife's. This is the one that she always is drawn to and has the most memories of. Talking of fond memories for a lot of people, Pit Fighter by Atari, released in 1990, is another popular game from back in the day. It's a legal fighting ring where anything goes, and it was never really a personal favourite of mine, if I'm honest, because I find that the fighting moves in the game are too limited and it's all not smooth enough to truly be fun, in my opinion. Still, it is notable for being the first fighter to use digitised graphics, being a whole 2 years before Mortal Kombat was released. Now, Midway Arcade Treasures 2 on the Xbox, GameCube and PS2 does have this game, and outside of MAME is probably the best way to play this game today. Now, another all-time classic is Namco's Pole Position. Released in 1982, this really took the racing game genre by storm, offering the now common behind-car viewpoint and great car handling mechanics. It was the games like this that truly led the way for titles like Outrun and Hang On by Yu Suzuki all those years later. Now, the best way to play this game today legitimately is on the Namco Museum 50th Anniversary Collection on the PS2, Xbox and GameCube, Also, of course, MAME has it emulated perfectly as well, although I find the controls a little too loose on those versions. Now, another title worthy of your time is Point Blank, released in 1994 by Namco, and it has its sequels. It's essentially crazy shooting target ranges for you to take on and blast your way through. It's a lot of fun and worthy of your time, even though I probably don't like it as much as other people. Now, talking games that I don't personally like as much as other people, another one is Sega's Pengo. Released in 1982, as you play a penguin, you must push blocks of ice to escape and defeat the enemies. One that I do enjoy is Power Stone, which is a great, along with its sequel, being full-on 4-player madcap arena fighting action. Now, released on the Naomi board in 1999, this is a 3D arena fighter with all-out fighter action. It really does get madcap as you're fighting your way through. It's a huge amount of fun. The Dreamcast home port is particularly good, and the game doesn't go for that much because it was quite popular in the day, so you can buy it up quite cheaply, or of course do the Redream emulator, which is a wonderful way to play the Dreamcast games. Now, another title is of course Punch-Out, released by Nintendo in 1984. Now, this is a game that's better known for its NES home port, which has Little Mac. Now, the arcade version is different because the original, which is the arcade version, has like a gridded fighter that you could look through. Obviously, the NES or Famicom couldn't do this, so they did a fantastic little sidestep by making the character really small, so you could still see the other player rather than try to do the grid. It works really well, and Little Mac was born as one of the Nintendo finest warriors. This is a fun game. It's got cool characters. I've never really gelled with Punch-Out as much as many of our American brethren, but there's clearly a lot to love here, and I do get why so many people have such nostalgic memories of this title. Talking of nostalgic memories though, the Puzzle Bobble series is well worthy of your time. Now, it is known as Bust a Move in certain quarters like the US and Europe, but I've always known it as Puzzle Bobble really. Released in 1994, this is a Taito puzzler. Has you aim a pointer gun that you can fire colours to match others to make them disappear when you get 4 in a line. All the while the roof is getting lower and lower, making this more and more difficult. It's a huge amount of fun and well worthy of your time with this one. Now, talking of puzzlers though, there is of course Compile's Puyo Puyo, published by Sega and released in 1992 in the arcades, although actually it was originally released in 1991 on the MSX and the Famicom by Compile. It's a really fun puzzle game. I'm sure you know it, even if you know it as Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine on the Mega Drive. It's essentially that was just a rebranding of this game, and it's essentially match up the falling colour blob to make disappear. What makes it particularly satisfying is getting chains of shapes falling, they clear, and it makes new lines as new lines of 4 line up as well. I certainly have a lot of love and time for the Puyo Puyo games. Okay, so they were the big hitters that failed to make my list, but I also have a stack of lesser known titles that I think are well worthy shouting out here because you might not have heard them or perhaps given them a play. Right, okay, first we have Pilot Kids by Saikyo. It was released in 1999, although the board says 1998. It actually came out in March 99. This is a cute 2.5D blaster. It has you control a toy plane and you're flying around a person's house room by room. It's very similar to games like Clockwork Knight in that regard. Now, thankfully, this is a great shooter that's now emulated perfectly on the Sega M2 emulator, so there's a great way to play it through that. Next, there's Planet Harrier. Yes, this was the last in the series to Space Harrier. It got released in 2000 in Japan, or 2001 in the West, and it's a game that never got really talked about. Now, this is probably partly because it didn't do very well. It's not that great in my opinion, but also it was on the Hikaru board, so it never really saw a port to any of the home consoles like the Dreamcast. Although surprisingly, you'd think it could have perhaps made it across to the Xbox reasonably well. For those who've played Panzer Dragoon is probably closer to Panzer Dragoon than Space Harrier in this, being a lot slower paced and just multiple targeting. It's not for me, it doesn't feel like Space Harrier to me personally. However, it's well worth giving a try and seeing what you think. Now, another game that's a real sort of hidden gem slash guilty pleasure for me is Photo Y2K. It's an arcade game released by RGDS in 1999, and it's essentially a spot the difference game, and I love it because it's that little bit different to arcade fare, and it just plays so well and fun and fast, and it genuinely keeps me engaged as I play through. It all does so fantastically well. Now, another one worthy of mention is the Capcom shooter called Pro Gear no Arashi, released in 2001. Now, this game has recently become much more popular, with it appearing on the Capcom Arcade Stadium collection on the Switch. Yes, it's one of the games you can pick up, and it's wonderful to see that that's the case, because this is a great blaster. It's got amazing bosses and wonderful bullet patterns, all as you live in a world of no adults and fly warplanes as kids to protect the ones you love. It's just a silly but fun horizontal shooter, well worthy of your time. Talking of hidden gems though, they don't go more hidden than this one, Puli Rula. Now, this is a wonderful Japanese bizarre scrolling beat-em-up by Taito. It was released in 1991 and saw a couple of home ports in Japan only on the Sega Saturn and the PS1. Now, it also did appear in the Japanese release of the Taito Legends compilation as well. It's set in Radish Land here, and you play Zack and Mel, two kids giving a magic stick to return the time key to its rightful place and owner, and this will sort things out in Radish Land. It's a huge amount of fun. I always love Japanese craziness, and this doesn't get any more crazy than this, trust me. Incidentally, the Japanese version is actually even more mad, with real sort of risky bits really in the game, such as two female legs poking out of two windows and a door that would sit in between where monsters will come out. It was all seen a little bit too risque for the Western releases, and these were sadly cut out on those releases, so I'd probably go for the Japanese version. Sadly though, outside of the Saturn and PlayStation, it's never saw a home port anywhere. Now, another game worthy of mention is of course Pink Sweets. This is essentially a sequel to Ibara, and it came out in 2006. Now, watchers of this series will know my love of cave shooters, so mentioning yet another cave shooter is probably not a surprise to you. But this is really rather good. The game was done by director Shinobu Yagawa, Battle Garega fame, and director Akira Wakanayashi of Dodonpachi fame, and working on many of Cave's finest games. Now, this one is probably one of the weaker ones, but I love it. It's got the bosses that were in that Ibara first game, where you actually get to play them in the second, which I think is a nice touch, and it's certainly a great shooter that has a wonderful port if you want it legitimately on the 360. You can, it's part of the double pack, and well worthy of your time. Unfortunately Japanese only. Now, talking of great shooters, I do love the horizontal blaster Polestar, released in 1995 and published by SNK, being developed by the Alcom Corporation. This is such an enjoyable shooter romp with pre-rendered 3D enemies on a 2D blaster, but don't let that fool you. This is a gorgeous looking game, and more importantly wonderful in the gameplay department, where it really counts. Now, another title well worthy of a mention is Power Gear Strategic Variant Armor Equipment, or rather boringly known as Armored Warrior in the West. Now, it was made by Capcom and released in 1994, and it's a scrolling beat 'em up. It passed many people by because it was quite late on and didn't really get a home port, and it's a real shame, as these mech controlling title is brilliant, and it works so well as a 3-player title to boot. Now, for beat 'em ups, I've saved the best for last though, because Capcom's often forgotten title, The Punisher, released in 1993, is brilliant and well worthy of your time. It is of course based on the Marvel anti-hero, and it lets you play him, or even cooler, Nick Fury. They're both really cool characters for you to control, and I love that to begin with, but this game is chock full of neat touches and there's nods to the comic book original, all as you defeat the criminal mastermind that is the Kingpin and his array of henchmen. This is such a fun game to play. Right, there you go. That was my top 5 for the letter P and a ton of honourable mentions. It certainly was a great letter, and I apologise for the length of this video, but I really wanted to give all these games a mention. For many of these games I had so much personal nostalgic memories for me, and it was great going through them again. I'm really happy with my choices that I've chosen now, but I can't wait to hear your suggestions and what you would choose for this letter. It's great discovering these games along with you. So anyway, look out for my next video for the letter Q. It's of course going to be short and sweet, thankfully, that episode, because there's not too many games in the letter to cover, but there's certainly some pearlers well worthy of your time. So until next time, keep it retro.